Hello, Slasia. I'm John Morgan, chair of the Scottish Room. The Scottish Room was actually one of the first rooms. It was originally slated to be built in the early 20s and was one of the first 6 rooms built. We have Pittsburgh here. A lot of Pittsburgh was initially settled by Scots and Scots-Irish. Scots-Irish being Scottish individuals who various and sundry times actually moved over to Ireland because they were told by the English, there's land there. They were fibbed too. They said, well, we have a place where there's some other land, go over there, take it, and it's yours. And they said, okay, but it's far enough away from you, you can't lie to us again. So, okay. So, we may start the slides of the room slides. I think that's for the next talk. So, pardon me, we're having a few audio-visual instances here. Anyway, the Scottish Room has several scholarships available, which is primarily one of the main reasons why these rooms function in their current state. As of right now, we have 4,000 or $5,000 scholarships split between undergraduate and graduate studies to go over and study next summer in Scotland. That's open to Pitt individuals who will be juniors and seniors next year, and applications will be starting in the next few months. So please, in all seriousness, we want to give you money. We want to give these students money to go over and study and expand their horizons and help make this a more cosmopolitan city. And that, again, is one of the purposes of the Nationality Rooms, to celebrate the differences and sameness that bring us together. Waiting for my slide. The Scottish Room is built on what is originally one of the precepts of the Nationality Room concept. Most of the Nationality Rooms, when they were first designed, were meant to show what a typical classroom would look like in that country. We now have the slides. It is meant to look as if what a classroom would look like in 1787. Now, real quick, anybody, why would that year be significant? That is the year that the Western University of Pennsylvania was founded, which is now also known as the University of Pittsburgh. So this is representative of a typical Scottish classroom in 1787. It has a fireplace, and if you note, there is a decorative, you go back one, motif above the fireplace, naming some of the great intellectuals, thinkers, and inventors of Scottish tradition, like Watt and Hume, Kelvin, and 2 statues representing William Wallace, any of you saw Braveheart, and Robert the Bruce. It was actually Robert de Bruce. He was a lowlander and, like many, was of Norman descent. One interesting thing about Scotland is it, like the United States, is a nation of immigrants. After the last ice age, no one was actually living in Scotland. It was covered by a glacier. So everyone who went into Scotland, the Picts, who came from Germanic peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, the Dalriadans from Ulster and Northern Ireland, all were immigrants to Scotland. And of course, you have a painting there, and you might be wondering who that is. That is the poet laureate of Scotland, Robert Bruce, also known as Rabbie. To those of us who truly admire his works are greatly celebrated. The one that you may be most familiar with is Auld Lang Syne, which we sing to celebrate New Year's, but also one of the great poems of humanitarianism and egalitarianism, A Man's a Man for That, along with others. Next slide, please. I don't know who this guy is. I don't know. He should have gone out and bought himself some hair at one point. These are our current officers. There are elections actually every 2 years. The volunteers and the all work extraordinarily hard to bring on programs like this and work with the university to promote the scholarship programs. Next slide, please. Now, there are several events that are very Scottish-oriented across the entire Commonwealth, across the entire world. One of which is Tartan Day. It is a celebration of the tartan, which has become synonymous with Scotland. It actually is a celebration more of what is known as the Treaty of Arbroath, which was the founding document of Scottish freedom. It is slightly over 700 years old. Its anniversary, unfortunately, was in 2020, kind of put off the celebration a little bit, but it was a document prepared because the Pope did not want to recognize, even though Scotland wanted to be independent of England in every way, shape, and form, that they wanted to have their own churches, they wanted to have their own king, their own identity. All of the barons, important people of Scotland, signed this document, attached their seals, because most of them were illiterate, and sent it off and received permission. And from that day forth, all Scots have been free and independent. If you have any questions on that, just go and ask one. We will give you a rather affirmative answer. Now, in celebration of Tartan Day, if you can go back, please. There are celebrations, one of which is held by one of the major local Scottish organizations, the St. Andrew's Society. It is held out at Bethel Presbyterian Church in Bethel Park every year. 700-800 people attend. It's magnificent. There are pipe bands, etc. But we are actually holding one as part of the room functions. Last year we brought in virtually some representatives from the Innovation and Technology Centers in Scotland, creating the virtual classroom. The Scots have always, particularly in the most recent history of the last 300-400 years, been leaders in engineering and technology. It is because education has very much been valued in Scotland. In fact, having the third English language university, St. Andrews, established many hundreds of years ago, and growing from that. There is a period of the Scottish Enlightenment. I could go on for hours, but I really don't want to bore you to death. Next slide, please. As you can see, we have the Celtic Culture program. It is our honor to be associated with our Celtic cousins, part of the 7 Celtic nations, 3 of which, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, represented here, also including the Isle of Man, Cornwall, yes, the one peninsula that comes off in England, Brittany, the one shore of France, and Galatia, the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula. One interesting fact is you see bagpipes there. You know who else have a really strong bagpiping tradition? The Basques of the northern Iberian Peninsula in Spain. As you can see, we have the dance. We have a handsome gentleman who piped us in and will be performing with us again today. And of course, we have George Balderos, the founder of the Balmoral School of Piping and Drumming. There's actually a major event that is sponsored partially and co-hosted by the Scottish Room, the Balmoral Classic. It is the only 21 and under piping and drumming competition in the United States. It will be held next month on the 12th. There will be some of the best young pipers, male and female. In 2019, the last time I was able to attend live, I think anyone here was able to attend live, a young lady actually won the days of competition. And also it holds a huge and tremendously popular and excellent music program as part of the event. It's going to be on November 12th. There are instructions on how to get tickets for a band named 7 Nations, who really kick out the jams. You'll enjoy it if you do attend. But it is part of our mission to assist in and honoring and perpetuating Scottish culture in this region. Next slide, please. As you can tell, because we do have one of the largest Scottish and Scots-Irish populations in the country, in the Pittsburgh area, There are a number of Scottish-related organizations in the area. They were here. Among them are the St. Andrew's Society, which is the region's Scottish Culture Organization. We have, again, the Balmoral School of Piping and Drumming. We have the Ligonier Highland Games, which are sponsored by Clan Donald. It is held annually in September out in Ligonier. We have the Scottish Country Dance Society, which perpetuates the tradition of Scottish dance, and the Pittsburgh Irish Festival, again, because the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, we oftentimes think of things in American perspective and scale. The British Isles aren't that big. These folks have met. And so we work with them in celebrating our common culture by appearing at the Pittsburgh Irish Festival and marching with them in solidarity at the St. Patrick's Day Parade. Besides, they do need some quality pipers. Oh, just kidding, Jack. Next slide, please. Now, as to more than just fun and entertainment, part of the mission of the rooms is to develop and really drive forward international involvement, a sense of a shared commonality with other countries and other cultures. So, one way that has been done traditionally in the last 50 to 80 years has been establishing sister city programs with similar type cities across the world. Then the last year or so, thanks to, in great part to one of our room members, Dr. Kenneth Thompson, we have developed a sister city relationship, or what is now known as twinning, with Glasgow, which pleased me to no small extent because one of my more recent Scottish ancestors is from Glasgow. I wear the blue, by the way, don't hold it against me. So within the last year, we formalized this relationship and have been moving forward in going with as part of the 100 Resilient Cities programs, which ties into studying how to bring old industrial cities into a more environmentally conscious, a more healthy environment, particularly with public health, and basically bringing these older cities into becoming more of a future-driven area, future-driven metropolitan area. It's these cities that were down, like Cardiff, lost a lot of industry, Glasgow lost a lot of industry, Manchester, all of these cities, how do they redo and rebirth themselves? This, by joining with other folks who are in commonality or sharing a shared experience, is part of the way we are moving forward. Next slide, please. And there are the two mayors of the different cities having signed the document last year. Now, why are we really here? It's for the students. What really does any organization tied into a university, what does it have to have as a primary objective? The future, these students. The Scottish Nationality Room this year is going to be offering 4, split between undergraduate and graduate scholarships to send individuals to study in an area related to them in Scotland. Yes, 5,000, no strings attached, except you have to be getting ready to become a senior or a junior. You have to have an appropriate GPA. We'll check. And I'm not going to say what it is because, to be honest with you, I just forgot. Kati, what is it, 2.5 or 3? You have to have at least a 2.75 GPA. And what you have to study has to tie into what you're looking into. I would encourage individuals, members of the university, students of the university, to apply. There are tremendous things being done in Scotland as far as new forms of energy, technology, computer science, developing the use of wave motion to generate energy. Scotland, in case you're curious, is energy independent at this point. they still use some hydrocarbons simply because they're selling so much of the excess electricity that they're making themselves with windmills, tidal energy, and dams, hydropower, but they sell it to England. These are the ways of technology in the spirit of Watt and those other individuals I showed you whose names are up on the wall in the Scottish room that will bring us into a future, and Scotland's a good place to learn about it. Next slide, please. Membership. It's not that expensive, folks. Heck, from what I've seen, that's not too much more than a cup of coffee at Starbucks. For an individual, it's $15, families $25, and you can use your credit card. Get your bonus points. Enjoy. And you can actually be part of bringing the world to these students. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. There's a lot of things to do, and really, because of how closely tied the different Scottish heritage organizations are in the city of Pittsburgh, it also opened up ways for you to meet individuals with these organizations, find what brings you bliss, and become part of it. Thank you. Now, for our first presenter, we have the room secretary and a fine young man himself, Mr. Bill McShane. He's going to explain some of the things that bring Pittsburgh and Scotland together, reflected in certain street names. Notice I didn't steal any of your thunder. Thank you. Bill. Here.
I think I could use this one, right, Perry? All right. So thank you, John. I also have to acknowledge, I was also a generous recipient of a Nationality Room grant in 2011, actually from the Irish Room. So I was able to take advantage of an opportunity to intern abroad through this opportunity. So I'm grateful to be able to be a part of the Nationality Room program and kind of give back in that role. Before I start on kind of a little bit on the streets, two interesting things that John alluded to earlier about the university's founding in 1787. Two Scotsmen were actually fairly integral to the start of Pitt. So the first was Hugh Henry Brackenridge, who was born in Scotland and was the state legislator at the time that introduced the bill that essentially founded Pitt. And then our first chancellor, Robert Bruce, was also born in Scotland and was the first, I think that back then it was known as the principal, but he became essentially the first chancellor of the university. For those of you that may not be aware, we're in the search for a new chancellor, so maybe we'll have another Scotsman come back around. I don't know. But to kind of dive in a little bit, I put this together as just kind of something of interest to me to kind of explore a little bit of the history and the heritage of the Scots in the region. So among the earliest European settlers here in Allegheny County were the Scots, who came from about 1717 until the American Revolution was sort of one of the largest influxes. And as a result of such a high concentration of Scots, you kind of see that reflected in the language a little bit. You hear words like ready, or red up, slippy, but you also see it reflected in some of the names around the area here. So I'd like to introduce you to a couple of these that maybe you're familiar with, but hopefully there's one or two that are sort of new for you. So we're going to start in Dunfermline Street, which is technically located in the Homewood North neighborhood of the city, but it kind of spans that Homewood North Point Breeze divide. So Dunfermline Street is actually named after a town, or it's actually a city now, just north of Edinburgh called Dunfermline, which is the birthplace of both John Forbes and Andrew Carnegie. Both are integral to the history of Pittsburgh. So on the right-hand side here, you can see that is Carnegie's birthplace, and that is Dunfermline Abbey. So John Forbes, he commanded the Forbes expedition during the French and Indian War, which drove the French and their allies out of the region, taking over Fort Duquesne, building Fort Pitt, and essentially founding the settlement that would grow to be Pittsburgh. He named it after the Prime Minister of Great Britain, William Pitt the Elder, and technically, if we were going by the Scottish pronunciation, we should call it Pittsburgh. And what about Andrew Carnegie? Well, Carnegie spent the first 12 years of his life in Dunfermline before he moved to Allegheny County, where he would go on to have a tremendous impact on the industrial and economic development of our area. The first of his, The first of his Carnegie libraries, that you can see there, was actually built in Dunfermline, and the second one is actually right across the street here at the main library in Oakland. But let's take a look at Forbes Avenue. So this is this is the longest street in the city, which basically runs from Wilkinsburg all the way through Point Breeze, Squirrel Hill, Oakland, and terminates downtown. Originally, parts of it were known as Diamond Street, but then it was changed by Mayor Lawrence during his time as mayor to be Forbes Avenue. So John Forbes, as I mentioned earlier, commanded the Forbes expedition, which included a number of men, including Highlanders, provincials from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland, as well as troops under the command of then Colonel George Washington. Setting out from Philadelphia in June, they went west via Lancaster, Carlisle, Shippensburg, Fort Loudon, and Raystown. Forbes actually constructed a new road. He decided not to follow the road that Braddock took earlier, which Colonel Washington at the time did not agree with, but Forbes essentially overruled him. Eventually, there was a failed attack on the fort, which I will mention in a few minutes here. But when they found it abandoned, they essentially captured the fort in 1759. He was actually fairly ill at the time, and he's actually buried in Philadelphia at Christ Church in Old Town. And the picture here at the bottom right is where Forbes' birthplace, which is in Dunfermline, Pitt and Creve House. Downtown, we have a street called Grant Street, which you may think is named after President James Grant, or General Ulysses Grant, but it's actually named after James Grant, a Scotsman who was part of the Forbes expedition. Forbes and Grant actually didn't really get along. Forbes thought he was not a great general. He called his attack on the fort, which left him captured actually by the French, a rash attempt. And he basically wanted to get rid of Grant. But as you can see here, this is the cut downtown where they sort of leveled the street. You can see kind of on the map where it is downtown. Grant was eventually paroled after the Forbes expedition. He kind of returns to American history as a commander of British troops during the American Revolution, but he eventually ends up settling back in the United Kingdom after the British defeat there. Another connection to this this era of history is Halkett Street, which is named after Sir Peter Halkett, who was a Scottish baronet and a member of Parliament. He was actually part of the Braddock expedition, which was the one that came before the Forbes expedition to try and capture Fort Duquesne from the French. This is where he's born, or his house outside of Dunfermline, Halkett House. As part of that Braddock expedition, both he and his son James were assigned to it. The expedition set out from Fort Cumberland in Maryland and proceeded slowly as General Braddock focused on constructing a road that he assumed would resupply his troops once he captured the fort. On July 9, 1755, the French and their Native American allies struck the British forces, and General Braddock fell, but also Peter and his son were killed as well. In 1758, Peter's son Francis, which was then part of the Forbes expedition, he retrieved both his father and his brother's bodies and took them back to Dunfermline. So the picture up here on the left is called the reunion, and that is the son gathering the remains and taking them back to Scotland. The last street I'd like to highlight is just around the corner here on Carnegie Mellon's campus, which is actually Margaret Morrison Street, which is named after Carnegie's mother. Margaret's mother was the one that actually was the primary force for pushing them to come to America. She actually took out the loan from one of her friends that enabled the Carnegies to travel here when Andrew Carnegie was a little boy. Carnegie actually adored his mother. If you read any of his autobiography, he wrote that the second daughter, about whom he cannot trust himself to speak at length, was his inherited the dignity and the refinement and air of a cultivated lady. He essentially said that his first book is dedicated to his heroine, my mother. So for more information, we have more of this up on some of our social media pages if you'd like to explore other Scottish history in the area. And next time you're on a street in Pittsburgh, we invite you to take a look at the name and think about the history behind it, as you may be surprised what you encounter. Thank you.
All right, a great tradition in Scotland is that of music and dance. We have next on our program a demonstration of Scottish mouth music by Mr. Paul Thompson, the Highland Dance performed by Katie Gennaro, and they will be accompanied by our bagpiper, who marched us in earlier, Sean Patrick Reagan.
Well, thank you. Thank you, John. We're going to start the Scottish dance program, actually, with bagpipes and Highland dance. What could be more Scottish than that? Sean Patrick Regan is going to present the pipes later, but we're grateful that he's playing for us today. And the dancer is going to be Katie Gennaro from Monroeville. She's a champion dancer. She's won trophies all over North America, the United States and Canada, including trophies at the USIR, the United States National Championships. So you have a champion dancer to dance for you. And as John said, most of our Scottish Celtic culture was oral. We carried our history down through poetry, through songs, and through dances. Every dance tells a story. And one of the pivotal moments in Scottish history was the 1745 uprising, the last Jacobite uprising. And the Blue Bonnets, which is the name of the dance Katie's going to dance, were common folk that Bonnie Prince Charlie roused up, and he got 600 herdsmen, farmers, hunters, shopkeepers. They all brought their own weapons, and some of them wore trews, trousers, rough cut trews. Some wore hodden grey kilts, some wore clan tartans. It was a mishmash. But the one thing they all wore was the blue bonnet, the blue woolen bonnet, typical of Scotland at the time. And this dance is named the Blue Bonnets. You might expect it's going to be danced, a martial dance, by a man. But this dance is a woman's dance. It's a flirtation dance. A young lass dancing to flirt with and attract the attention of her blue bonnet before they go off to war. So look for the graceful flowing movements of the woman's dance as Katie Gennaro comes out to dance the Blue Bonnets with Sean Patrick Regan piping. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Katie. Katie will be back in a minute. I'm going to give a brief few words of introduction so that Katie can catch her breath. After the defeat at Culloden, life in the Highlands was hard, and Highland hospitality has a big part in this next dance. Hospitality is my military dirk, a weapon, and people often ask, what are these two things? Well, they're a knife and a fork. People in the Highlands were poor, but Highland hospitality, you'd never be turned away without being offered a meal. A hunting party might arrive at a shieling or a croft, and you'd be offered food, but they often wouldn't have extra cutlery. So you carried your own as a Highlander. When Bonnie Prince Charlie fled after Culloden, Culloden, by the way, is often depicted in 1746 as England versus Scotland. It really wasn't. It was Scotland versus Scotland. It was a civil war. A lot of the Scots didn't want to go to war, and a lot of the Scots did want to go to war. So when Bonnie Prince Charlie, after the defeat at Culloden, fled across Scotland, he had a £30,000 price tag on his head. That's $5 million today. And nobody turned him in. Over 20 weeks on foot, nobody turned him in for the money. And when he got to Benbecula, where he met Flora MacDonald, that's the next dance that's coming up, he was in enemy territory. The MacDonalds had pled allegiance to the Hanoverian house, and when Prince Charles initially arrived, he had to bribe some Camerons to get anybody to follow him. Why? Well, the Western Isles, the clans were pretty much self-sufficient. They didn't care who was King of Scotland. That was in Edinburgh. Could have been on another planet. And they certainly didn't care who was King of England or Ireland. And that was what Bonnie Prince Charlie was after, the 3 crowns that his grandfather had. So when he was in the Western Isles, he was really in enemy territory. And when he met Flora MacDonald, she had to contact her father, Hugh MacDonald, who was commander of the Royal Militia on Skye. So he was hunting Bonnie Prince Charlie down. He arranged to give them safe passes and told Flora to ferry him over to the house in Skye. The Skye boat song, you may have heard, is where that comes from. She arrived at Kingsborough House, and her father had the safe passes, but there was one problem. The house was full of royal officers, and they were dining, so they needed a distraction to help the prince escape to the French warship. And Flora MacDonald danced for them to distract them while Bonnie Prince Charlie was spirited away to France. So here's Katie again and Sean again for Flora MacDonald's Fancy. Thank you, Sean and Katie. You've seen two of our women's dances. We're going to finish with probably the best-known Highland dance, the Highland Fling. And it's the victory dance of the Scots. It traditionally was danced after battle. Many of you have seen Highland warriors with that Taj, that circular shield with a big spike. At the end of battle, if they were still alive, they'd stick the spike in the ground and dance on the back of the shield. So this is the only Highland dance that's actually danced on the spot. After Culloden, there was a brutal repression in Scotland. Weapons were forbidden, tartans were banned, clan chiefs lost all authority. There was really, even the Gaelic language was put down. Bagpipes were classed by the courts to be an instrument of war. So with no bagpipes, what are you going to dance to? Well, we're going to dance as a demonstration for you to Porth de Béal, mouth music. It has a long history in Scotland of working songs. Women used to line up to walk the cloth. It was soaked in urine to get out the impurities. If you have heard the saying, he doesn't have a pot to piss in, if you were poor, you had a pot and you sold your urine. If you were really poor, you didn't have a pot to piss in. So that's where that comes from. But they would walk the cloth and they pound it to get the warp and the weft to knit together to full out the cloth. And they pound it and pass it on. A whole line of women pounding the cloth. And they use mouth music. Brock and loam, tanna loam, brock and loam, na soo. And they'd always pass it to the left. Widdershins is to the right. That's unlucky. But we're going to have Katie dance to mouth music. And just as an aside, when I came over in 1970, I missed my sister by 2 years. She won the Scottish National in Inverness for Gaelic singing. And when she came over to visit us at Kennywood on Scottish days, she sang Porth de Béal for the dancers to dance the Highland Reel. So now Katie is going to dance the Highland Fling, the victory dance of the Scots, to Ta Mulad. Its song means it's sadness, a Ta Mulad. And it's two women, they've fallen out, and one is sad about losing her friend. So here's Katie for the Highland Fling to Ta Mulad.
Nen steht man haken nach hast der Hut markrachen steht kann ich scham führen mit mochwas doye kann ich scham führen mit mochwas doye nagam vahener mi khur mi kutrem nakem nagam vahener mi khur mi kutrem nakem asakta men mokhia nach toksial nanjet
Thank you, Katie. And I will hand over to John.
Thank you. Let's have another round of applause for the dancer and the piper. Thank you. Well, as we showed in the presentation of the room design earlier, the poet laureate of Scotland is Robert Burns, a world-renowned poet, a legend in a lot of quarters. And Normally the celebration of Scottishness, being a Scot, worldwide is celebrated with the Burns Supper. We now have with us the chair of the Burns Supper Committee for the St. Andrews Society, Dale McLeod, who will explain the traditions of the Burns Supper and why we celebrate that night.
Thanks. You sound like Alistair Cook on Baby.
Thank you, John. My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. My love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune.
Yes.
As fair thou art, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. When American singer-songwriter Bob Dylan was asked a few years ago to name the lyric or the verse that most inspired him in his own work, he responded with those opening lines from a song written by a poet born in Scotland almost 250 years earlier, Robert Burns. In fact, Jessica earlier referred to the Robert Burns of Wales. But not everybody knows about him. He's got a fine story that we don't have time to fully talk about today, but I want to talk about some of the aspects of Robert Burns that then translate into an annual celebration of him. He was born in the mid-18th century, only 50 years after Great Britain was created by uniting the parliaments of England and Scotland. And British society observed very distinct social classes, where the aristocracy and the common people understood their respective places, and they didn't cross one another, didn't cross over lines. Robert was born into the family of a farmer, and was most definitely a common man in social class and in spirit. As he matured, he reveled in the values of the commoners. Scotland was one of the most literate countries in Europe at the time. John alluded to that. Our Scottish Nationality room is in the form of a classroom. The Presbyterian church, called the Kirk, was very influential, and they required all parishes to educate their parishioners primarily so they could read the Bible for themselves. But of course, if you can read the Bible, you can read anything that you get your hands on. And Burns did not get any formal education through the schools, but his father, who was very set on providing an education, coordinated with some other families in the neighborhood, and they got a teacher that ended up being very influential for Burns to understand and to read the classics in English. And it also helped him to be able to think for himself. And he developed an interest in poetry. He was in his mid-teens when he wrote his first poem to impress a wee lass that he worked in the fields with. And as time went on, he loved the lasses. He really loved the lasses. And throughout the remainder of his relatively short life, he wrote many poems and songs about the topic of love. And as Burns grew, he wrote many other poems and songs about other issues as well. Very prominent was the aspect of social equality and nature and hypocrisy. And he poked fun at the upper crust of society's great and good, all themes that still can resonate today. But at age 27, he had accumulated a large number of poems, and he was persuaded by some friends to publish them, so he did. The book was called Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. The Scottish dialect, also called Auld Scots and Doric, was the primary language of lowland Scotland, not the Highland, or not Scottish Gaelic, which was in the Highlands, but the Auld Scots and the Scottish dialect was really the primary language in the lowlands. And so when he wrote his poems, he was very often writing it in the Scottish dialect. And of course, the title of his book prominently displays that. It was another way he was proud of his common Joe upbringing and the people that were like him. Well, his book of poems became a massive hit within Scotland and then outside its borders. It was the first known celebration of Scottish heritage in America that we know that included Robert Burns' work was right here in Pittsburgh in 1790. And included among the participants at that gathering, which was about 20 people that evening in late November of 1790, was a fellow named Hugh Henry Brackenridge. He was born in Scotland, emigrated with his family when he was very young over to York County, got educated in Philadelphia, and by 1781, he came to the western frontier town here of Pittsburgh as one of this area's first lawyers. He became a Pennsylvania state assemblyman, and he obtained an endowment for the Pittsburgh Academy, which eventually became here the University of Pittsburgh. So that party that was here in Pittsburgh, 1790, Brackenridge was among a group of Scots who typically, they enjoyed a typical Scottish evening that included bagpiping and singing and recitation of Robert Burns' works and plenty of toasting going on at the time. So today doesn't really permit a fuller story about Robert Burns' life or his works, but suffice it to say that this guy who began life as a farmer's son with limited financial prospects became an internationally regarded poet and songwriter. He never became wealthy, and that was never his objective. He needed to be comfortable to raise his family, though. And he died at a relatively young age of 37, but he made a worldwide impact with his pen. It was estimated that some 10,000 people lined the streets of his funeral in a small town called Dumfries. And this was a guy who was revered but never lost sight of who he was, a real regular Joe. So let's turn our attention now to Burns Night, or Burns Suppers, that phenomenon which has occurred now annually. So 5 years after the poet died, 9 of his friends got together back in the cottage in Alloway where he was born, just a small 2-room cottage, and they gathered to celebrate the poet's memory and to dine on haggis and singed sheep's head. Yum. They enjoyed reciting several of their personal favorites. Among Burns' poems and songs, they raised many a glass in toasting the national bard. It was sort of a convivial evening, the kind that Robert Burns himself would have enjoyed. They intentionally made it something that he would have enjoyed. And by the end of the evening, they all agreed that they were going to celebrate such an event annually, every year, either in July at the anniversary of Robert's death or in January at the anniversary of his birthday. This sort of a tribute gained momentum. Similar dinners spread throughout Scotland, then to England, then to all the British colonies. And by 2009, the 250th anniversary of his birth, there were over 3,600 Burns suppers held in 80 countries around the world. Some were and are very large events, and some are modest, held in somebody's home, all with the sincere celebration of Robert Burns, the common person. So all traditional Burns nights include the basic elements that began that night in 1801 with an emphasis on sociability. That's the sort of environment that Burns preferred, and they tend to begin with a haggis being piped ceremoniously into the room and a recitation of his poem called Address to the Haggis extols the virtues of a haggis, a lowly peasant's meal, compared to the fancy schmancy cuisine of the aristocracy. Just so you know what a haggis is, it's made of some of the less desirable but more affordable parts of a sheep: the liver, heart, lungs. Throw in oatmeal, onions, some seasoning that comes to hand, grind it up, stuff it into the stomach of the sheep, and boil it. It included the parts that were left after the better cuts were eaten, but it kept families alive who didn't always have access to meat. And in the address to the haggis, the poem celebrates the poorer people and advocates for equality among all classes in any society. The dinner menu at today's Burns Nights usually has a Scottish theme, but it does not include strictly the haggis or the singed sheep's head. So we hope to see you at some of these events, but don't be scared away. The other expected features of a Burns supper are a speech given by somebody to talk about what matters to them and why all these decades, centuries later, we still have the National Bard of Scotland still worthy of being celebrated. And let's see here. And then there's, that would be called the Immortal Memory. Then a gentleman during the evening will provide a toast to the lasses. A lady will provide a response from the lasses, and that typically pokes fun at men's quirks and foibles, all in good nature. And there's always going to be some form of entertainment, music, dance, poetry. John talked about I coordinate with plenty of help, of course, but I am chairman of the Burns Supper here in Pittsburgh, posted by the St. Andrew's Society. And I just want to let you know that our next Burns Supper is Saturday evening, January 28th. We hold it at Lamont Restaurant on Mount Washington. Whether you're a member of the society or not, you are welcome. So please pay attention to our website, standrewspittsburgh.org. But also consider membership. John was talking about membership, and the annual dues are ridiculously inexpensive, $25 a year. We have events throughout the year besides this one. So returning to the basic elements of a traditional Burns night, the evening always ends with everyone joining hands and singing a song that you probably know but perhaps are not aware was written by Robert Burns, Auld Lang Syne. A translation of that Scottish dialect would be times long past, and the song acknowledges that we have friends and family that we may not have seen for a while and may never see again, and it encourages us to remember them fondly and to cherish the times that we do have with those still around us. That sentiment is perfect to sing at midnight on New Year's Eve as we ring out the old year and welcome in the new year, creating new memories. So I'll close my comments here about Burns and how we celebrate the National Bard with just a couple lines of Auld Lang Syne. Should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should all acquaintance be forgot and Auld Lang Syne? And there's a hand, my trusty fear, companion, and gi's a hand of thine, and we'll take a right good willy walked, a deep draught drink for Auld Lang Syne. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. Excellent. Now we'd like to bring back Sean Patrick Reagan, who has just received over the last year one of the few times this has been given. I believe it might be the first time at Carnegie Mellon, a master's in piping. He is one of the region's finest pipers. He instructs at one of the regional universities and is just the man himself. Sean, would you be so kind as to come out and explain a little bit about the piping program and present some of your art? Thank you.
Thank you. So I am actually the second. The first one is, the first graduate of the program was Andrew Bova, now Dr. Bova, and I had the pleasure of having him comment on my final submissions for the master's program. One of the things that has come up, and it's been really a kind of constant point of humor for me, is no one knows how to react when you tell them that you're pursuing a Master of Music in bagpipe performance. They think you're having them on for a laugh or something. And that kind of begs the question, why would you? Why would you have one, let alone why would you pursue one? There's plenty of good bagpipers out there making a decent living, or reasonable and okay living, you know, it's that don't have any kind of degree, let alone one in music performance. And what I'll start to answer that by, and I'm going to keep it super short because, well, I won't spoil anything just yet. Patterns. If you look for patterns, you'll find them. And if you look for good patterns, you'll find good patterns. There have been a lot of not so great patterns over the last couple of years. What has been great is the patronage of the arts. That when all of the performances disappeared in 2020, the organizations and establishments stepped up. And I was one of many that benefited from the graciousness of the organizations. A lot of the history that you've received today is well documented. Bagpipe history has not been very well documented. Traditionally, of course this is not a universal rule, but traditionally, pipers have been much more about the doing than about the documenting. And it's only because of the organizations or the establishments that have preserved those records where they are that we have much of any history about piping. What I'd like to do is I'm going to tell you to read. I know, sorry, you've got an assignment, but as you leave the room, just glance and take a moment to read the quote on the left. Big thing, I've been here a number of times over the years, never actually took time to stand and read that quote, but it sums up quite a lot of what I'm going to demonstrate for you here. There's a story, a series of stories called The Lost Pibroch by Neil Monroe, and there's a line early on in it which says, "To the make of a piper goes 7 years, and 7 generations before." And there's a little bit, and then it comes back and says, "At the end of 7 years, one born to it will stand at the start of knowledge, and leaning a fond ear to the drone, may have parley with old folks of old affairs." And there's an entire story that follows that. And I won't tell you about the story, except that it's lovely, kind of, and it ends with a blind piper. The thing that has made piping persist, the thing that made it so important to Andrew Carnegie, that has made it so important to, I think, most of the people here, is that the sound speaks. With only 9 notes, it speaks in a language that anyone can understand. So I'm going to play a tune that was written by a blind piper, Ian Dall Mackay, who was, as it happens, 8 generations before me. Jimmy McIntosh, who started the program at CMU, would have been the 7th generation himself. And I've got Andrew and my dad as 1 generation between me and Jimmy. So we're a generation more than it takes, perhaps. We'll see. And what I'd like you to do is sit back and close your eyes, and I'm going to play the first and second sections of a tune called Lament for Donald Dougal Mackay. Donald Dougal Mackay passed away in the mid-1600s, and he was a hero by all accounts. And it's a lovely piece of music. And as I was learning it from Andrew during the last year at CMU, I had flashbacks, not just to my early life, but it seemed to be much earlier. So, sorry, it means a lot to me. I'm just going to play those and listen to the drone. It won't be in tune the whole time, but I found that that's not the biggest thing. That's not the most important thing. Listening and that sound is. So, give me just a moment. I'll get some air into these, and then we'll have the ground and first variation, Lament for Donald Dougal Mackay. So don't forget to take a glance at that quote on the way out. We'll be in sort of parading spirit at that point. But if you want to hear more Pittsburgh, which was that style of music, someone mentioned the Balmoral Classic will be coming up on November 12th, and we'll have several, about a dozen very, very talented young musicians playing not only Pittsburgh, but some of the faster tunes as well. So thank you very much, and I'll see you a little bit later on.
Let's hear another round of applause for Sean. Thank you, thank you. Now, for our final performer of the afternoon, we're saving the best for last. You're doing a presentation on Scottish Halloween traditions, a poem, and of course, any Scottish event has to be ended with a toast. Mr. Arthur Macara.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to talk to you about Scottish Halloween traditions. Well, the truth of the matter is that Halloween in Scotland today, or next week, is indistinguishable from Halloween held here in Pittsburgh, with superhero costumes all to the fore and people going out and asking you to give them candy. However, it was from Scotland that the Halloween tradition came to America. There's a number of Christian ceremonies and festivals have syncretized with pagan festivals. Christmas is another one. And the word Halloween itself comes from All Hallows Eve, or the evening, which is October the 31st, or in Scots it would be called All Hallows E'en, or Halloween. And it came about that the Gaelic Day, the Gaelic festival, starts from sunset to sunset. That's why you have the 31st, and then All Hallows Eve is on the 1st. So, one of the problems that I have today, I wear a contact lens, just one. I'm Scottish, I can't afford two. Just the one, and I wear it in my left eye. And about a half an hour ago, it decided to either go that side, or up or down, or somewhere, and I can't see what I'm trying to read over here. So hopefully I can remember. But my boyhood was a long time ago. But I think perhaps I can remember what we used to do. But these are certainly the reasons why it's called Halloween, and it does come from the Scots word. And that came from a word that you've heard twice here already this afternoon, once from our Irish friends and the other one from the Welsh, which is, in the Scots, is Samhain. Samhain, Sovereign, but Samhain in the Scots, which was harvest time and the beginning of winter, between the two solstices. And so it was about this time that fairies and ghosts were supposed to be about. When the fabric between this world and the other side was at its thinnest, and the spirits, both from here and from there, could cross over. Are you getting scared? No? Okay. Well, it's not till next week, so you get plenty of time to get yourself prepared. Lock yourself in a cupboard under the stairs or something, and just wait until it's all over, and then you'll have nothing to worry about. fairies and ghosts. So you either had to dress like them or you had to appease them. And that started the Scottish tradition of guising or disguising. And that's where the word comes from. And so we used to dress up and go out. Because appeasing the spirits was by giving them something to eat or drink. So folks would get dressed up and go out pretending to be spirits and ask their neighbours for something to eat, not usually anything to drink when you were a child, but asking them for something to eat. Costumes back in these days were all anticipated with great excitement, purely and simply because they were always homemade. They were never store-bought. If there ever was such a thing as a store-bought costume, we probably couldn't have afforded it anyway. But that's what it was. So, favourite for boys was to dress up as a pirate. And for that, you needed a pair of the old-fashioned striped pajamas, right? And with a scarf, a colourful scarf tied around your head, and maybe a wooden sword. Girls would dress up as Little Bo Peep or Red Riding Hood. Fiona, what did you dress up as? You can't remember. I'm just putting Fiona on the spot. I'm sorry. And you would go from door to door, usually the same as they do today, in a group with your friends, but no parents. My mother and father would no more have gone out with me in Halloween than flown through the air. If I wanted to go out for Halloween, and that's what I did. If I didn't, then I didn't. It's as simple as that. So you went to the door, you knocked on the door, and someone looked at you and kind of examined your costume. Okay. Oh, that's very good. Or, not much imagination there. And you would ask for your Halloween. But there was no basket of candy. You went into the house, invited into the house. Can you imagine that today? Jeez. Sad. And when you got into the house, you had to perform. You had to sing a song. You had to recite a poem, or maybe even tell a joke. I don't think I ever saw it, but I'm pretty sure some of the girls would dance. But you had to perform, and dependent upon the performance was what you got. Very rarely candy or sweets, very rarely. Usually apples or oranges, maybe a pomegranate. And then you would go on to the next house. And it was the same performance all evening as long as you could last. If you were very lucky, you might get a small coin, maybe a threepenny bit, huh? If you don't know what a threepenny bit is, ask Fiona later, she'll do it. So, these are what the customs were back in my day. And as I say, today, it's unfortunate that it has now become an exercise in begging with a pillowcase because you expect to get so much and then go home and, I don't know, make yourself sick, I suppose. But it's an old tradition that's been going on for Well, back to my parents' time, I guess. Now, so the beginning of the 20th century. So well over 100 years, just what I've told you. And there are many more traditions throughout Scotland, because parties were a big thing. Halloween parties. And at Halloween parties, you would play games. One of them was called Duking for Apples. You got a big basin or a baby's bath or something like that, filled it with water, put in the apples, stirred the apples all around. You knelt beside this on the floor, put your hands behind your back so that you couldn't cheat, and you had to try and pick an apple out of this watery mess with your teeth. Well, you can imagine what happened. The place finished up soaking wet, and you finished up soaking wet, and you still never got an apple. And a variation on this was to have a chair beside this water and kneel on it facing down and hold a fork between your teeth. With the apples birling around in the middle, you dropped it and tried to spear an apple. Have you ever tried to eat a scone? You know what a scone is? Scone. Which is covered in treacle, similar to molasses. Black, sticky stuff, very sweet. So this treacle's covered in a scone. The scone is suspended from the ceiling on a string, and you have to try to eat it again without the use of your hands. Well, more scone and more treacle went in your hair and on your face and dripped onto your clothes. They never went into your mouth, believe me. There are a number of other games that were played, and we've heard mention today of Robert Burns. And Robert Burns is mentioned in Scottish culture for a great number of reasons. Number one, he was a marvellous poet. He was also, as Dale has told you, a man of the people and a great thinker. But Rabbie, his mother and her cousin's widow, a woman called Betty Davidson, were great in their knowledge of Scottish fairy stories and about witches and warlocks. And so the best ghost story, and I can only suggest that you read it on Halloween itself, maybe by the light of a jack-o'-lantern, that's that hollowed out turnip with a candle in the middle of it. And by the way, we now grow pumpkins in Scotland so that we don't have to carve the hard to carve, as you've already been told, turnip. Of course, you don't get the turnip soup afterwards with the stuff you carved out in the middle of the turnip, but that's just, I suppose you could make pumpkin pie of what you carve out in the middle of the pumpkin. And Rabbie wrote that Tam O'Shanter, which is a long story, although it's in rhyme. And it's maybe the best ghost story you'll ever read. You should read it on Halloween if you want to scare yourself. And in that, he talks about nights when ghaists and hoolits nightly cry. A ghaist, of course, is a ghost, and a hoolit is an owl. And he goes on to talk about hatchets with red crusted. In other words, they've been used to kill somebody. And then he sees the devil and the devil's followers in Alloway Kirk dancing. The devil doing what Sean just did, playing the bagpipes and making them skirl. And Tam has to eventually run away with the help of his grey mare Meg. But Robert Burns wrote another poem, one you may not have heard of. It's one of the longest one he ever wrote. I think it's 19 verses. You could look that one up too. You know, you can get anything on the internet. Anything. And it's called Halloween. And in that poem of Halloween, Robert talks about some very old Scottish traditions, which were maybe even not being followed anymore in his time, which was the end of the 18th century, as Dale told you. But he talks about nut burning. You take nuts like hazelnuts, you throw them in the fire. And depending on how they come out, depends on who you're going to marry. Or kale pulling. I'm not making this up, you know. This is true. Kale pulling is as you go into the field and you pull kale with your eyes closed so that you don't cheat. And the shape of the kale is supposed to give you an indication of the outline of the person whom you will marry, and the amount of dirt hanging to the roots will tell you how well off or otherwise that person will be. So we never did that. I'm not that old, not the 18th century. And so Robbie Burns is in just about every part of Scottish life because that's what he did. He reflected Scottish life. If that gives you an idea about the traditions of Halloween in Scotland, then I'm glad to have been of help. But since I am the last act, or turn, as we would have said on Halloween's night in Scotland, it falls to me to propose a toast. We're going to have two toasts tonight. I'm going to propose one. And a certain gentleman sitting in the audience who is not making a move, so this concerns me greatly. Because generally speaking, when you're having a toast, you do it with a drink. And I was promised that the drink's not here, so I guess we're not doing it with a drink. You're doing it without a drink. But my toast is to all of you, to the chairs and the members of the committees, of the cultural rooms, and to all those who have helped to put this together. Thank you all. To the technical staff, all of the performers, of course, but primarily to you yourselves sitting here in the audience. And I hope that you have enjoyed yourself. And I would ask you to rise, please, or be upstanding. So, it's my pleasure now to raise a toast to you, ladies and gentlemen, all of you. Thank you all very much. And we look forward to doing this again next year. Ladies and gentlemen, here's to us, was like us, damn few, and they're all deed.
One more toast.
Just one more toast. As many of you know, 6 weeks ago, Queen Elizabeth II passed away. Our Queen in Balmoral Castle in Scotland, her favourite castle. She served us faithfully. A lot of people don't know that the British Commonwealth is quite a unique institution. It covers a third of the world's population. She was Queen of the Commonwealth with 2.5 billion people. And in her lifetime, she served as sovereign states, 32 sovereign states she was Queen of in her lifetime. And she served us faithfully. So in remembrance, I'd like to propose a toast to the late Queen Elizabeth II. She was Scottish through her ancestry, direct from King James VI of Scotland, who was James I of England, the Stuart line. And she had another good dose of Scottish blood from her mother, the Queen Mum, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who was Scottish. And I had the honor to meet both of them in my life, and they both epitomized what I mentioned earlier in the dancing about Highland hospitality. With the Queen Mother, I was Military Cadet of the Year, and I was the only one on parade in uniform with a kilt. And so she came at the garden party afterwards and spent 15 minutes asking me about what I was doing, where I was going to college, and so on, just like a mum. So she was effectively known as the Queen Mum, and Queen Elizabeth was equally gracious. I'd also like to propose a toast to our new king, King Charles III, and wish him well on his reign, and we're looking forward to great things from him. So toast to the Queen, the late Queen, and to King Charles III. Thank you.
Now you guys go follow it. Go follow it. Go follow it. Pipe out.